Okay, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Good, good. My name is Linton Kwesi Johnson, and I am the chairman of 198 Contemporary Arts and Learning. We're very pleased to be hosting this event in partnership with the George Padmore Institute, an archive of political and cultural activism during the second half of the 20th century. We welcome this opportunity to revisit an important chapter in the history of the Black experience in Britain, the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, 1982 to 1995. The book fair documents are part of the George Padmore Institute's archives. The book fair years coincided with the onset. I'm just going to try and offer a little bit of context. Hopefully I won't be preempting anything our main speaker has to say. The book fair years coincided with the onset of the Thatcherite period, when the Tory government began clawing back the gains that the working class had won in the post-World War II settlement. It was a time when the struggle for racial equality and social justice had gained momentum. The Bristol riots of 1980 perhaps set the tone for what was to come during the 1980s. In January of 1981, there was the New Cross massacre, where 13 black youngsters were murdered in a fascist arson attack on a birthday party. The response was the Black People's Day of Action, when 20,000 people took to the streets to protest on the 2nd of March of that year. This was soon followed by the insurrections which began in Brixton and spread to the inner cities in April of 1981. Then again in 1985, there were further uprisings in the inner cities which began in Tottenham. 2 years later, in 1987, Diane Abbott, Paul Boateng, Bernie Grant, and Keith Vaz became members of Parliament for the Labour Party. The book fair years also saw a new burst of creativity in the arts from the second generation of Caribbean migrants, the rebel generation who had matured. Our main speaker, Dr. Roxy Harris, is a veteran activist, an old comrade of mine. He's a retired senior lecturer in sociology from King's College University. He is co-editor of, can you hold that up? He's the co-editor of A Meeting of Continents, which documents the book fair years. And he's also the chairman of the George Padmore Institute. Can we welcome Dr. Roxy Harris, please?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. If you can't hear me, just indicate if my voice drops down too much. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. So, the book fair rested on 3 foundations, each with Caribbean roots. These foundations had resettled in North, West, and South London. They were personified in the figures of John La Rose, Jessica and Eric Huntley, and Dorcas Howe. As John La Rose used to regularly state, we did not come alive in Britain. John himself had been prominent in the independence movement in Trinidad and Tobago in the late 1940s and the 1950s, and in culture had co-authored a seminal book on Calypso. Jessica and Eric Huntley had been very active in the independence movement in Guyana and experienced the nefarious manoeuvrings of the British colonial authorities. Dorcas Howe had had a close connection with the 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and was steeped in the carnival movement there. So these were sophisticated operators in radical black politics and culture. John had long participated in diaspora cultural and political initiatives. In the 1960s in London, he had co-founded the Caribbean Artists Movement, CAM. In 1968, he had attended the Havana Cultural Congress in Cuba alongside C.L.R. James. If you want an account of that, a really brilliant book by Andrew Salkey called Havana Journal is worth reading. In 1970, John attended the Caribbean Writers and Artists Conference in Guyana. And again, Andrew Salkey produced a brilliant book about it called Georgetown Journal. The three foundational poles were also experienced in publishing books and other texts. John, with Sarah White, had founded New Beacon Books in the Finsbury Park area of North London in 1966. And apart from selling books by and about black people, had begun publishing books. For instance, they had republished Minty Alley by C.L.R. James and published Folk Culture of the Slaves in Jamaica by Kamau Brathwaite, amongst others. Jessica and Eric Huntley had founded Bogle Louverture Bookshop and Publications in 1968 in Ealing, West London, to sell and publish books by and about black people. They published, for instance, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney and Dread Beethenberg by Linton. Race Today, from its home here in Brixton, South London, this very road, was publishing a regular and very professionally produced journal documenting the struggles of Britain's working class black and brown populations here and in their former colonial home countries with which they were still closely connected. Eventually, there emerged from these three interrelated axes of activism a political alliance comprising the Black Parents Movement, the Black Youth Movement, and the Race Today Collective. It was from all of these foundations that the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books was forged. The locations of the first three book fairs reflected the three geographic networks in London. So the first book fair opened on the 1st of April 1982 in Islington Town Hall, North London. The second book fair, 1983, was based in Lambeth Town Hall, South London. In 1984, the third book fair operated from a base in Acton Town Hall, West London. After that, the book fair settled on a regular base each year at Camden Town Hall, the Camden Centre in Bidborough Street, near Euston and King's Cross. Linton spoke earlier about the political context within which the book fair arose. The book fair was a massive voluntary effort by a lot of people, and its scope is too vast for me to do it justice in tonight's event. But of course, as we said, it's this massive book that gives you a fair documentation of some of the scope of it. So what I'm going to do is to try to give you some insights in two ways. First, I'll focus on the ways in which John La Rose was central to the conception and successful realization of the book fair. Secondly, I'll try to give you a flavour of how I was personally connected to John and the evolution of these processes. Believe me, at times John stretched me to my limits. I'd met John in 1975 and was very closely connected to him until he died in 2006. He involved me in the supplementary schools movement, in the Black Parents Movement, fighting numerous campaigns against police corruption and violence against black youth, and in many international campaigns for social justice for black people, including the Grenada Revolution. He also involved me in the work of New Beacon Books, including but not restricted to its publishing work. Linton has already mentioned how deeply involved we had been in 1981 with the New Cross Master Action Committee from January to March, and in organising the Black People's Day of Action on March 2nd, 1981. And also we expended a lot of energy in the New Cross Master Inquest at County Hall in April 1981. So you can see how busy we were, how active we were, the roots of what we did. It was in this context that John said we should have an international book fair in which we would bring people to London from all over the black diaspora. What? John? How? That's me, that's my voice. we have no money to do this. John said he would write to his global contacts and invite them to the event, telling them that they would have to pay their own fares to get here. But once here, we could offer them modest accommodation in the homes of ordinary families in the black community. This was possible because our activism over the previous years in the areas I mentioned earlier meant that we had built a solid periphery of support in the black community, which was willing to help in this way. So John, in the second part of 1981, circulated around the world what was termed the call to the book fair, the first book fair. So we reached December 1981, and I was at the annual Black Parents Movement fundraising Christmas party focused on the children around us, when John introduced me to an older Jamaican black man, Mr. Rose from Stanford Hill. John said he had promised Mr. Rose that we would get his son Newton, who had just been jailed for life for the murder of a white youth connected to the National Front, out of jail. John, what? How? With all this book fair thing coming, all the stuff we're doing, we're now going to do this. It's impossible. So in January 1982, we embarked on an intense campaign to free Newton Rose. I remember, amongst other things, demonstrating outside Wilmot Scrubs prison and picketing Hackney police station. I remember Linton fronting a campaign fundraising music event in Stoke Newington. On 9th of March 1982, just over 3 months later, Newton Rose was freed, and the Court of Appeal quashed his conviction. Less than 3 weeks after that, we launched the first international book fair of radical black and third world books. The book fair, I want to talk about its structure, because it had a very specific structure. No sooner had John got people like me to swallow the idea that we could pull off the book fair concept, then he said, we should surround the book fair with an international book fair festival week. Come on, John. He reasoned that we couldn't bring all these people here from all over the world without offering them something more than a simple 3-day book fair. So what happened was that people would arrive on a Saturday or Sunday, and we organised a nightly programme of events on politics and culture for them, which we called forums. These involved panels of speakers dialoguing with each other and with the audience. On the handout which you put on the chair, you can see a selection of some of the range of topics covered. And maybe later on you might want to comment or ask questions about some of these. Partway through the week, on the Thursday lunchtime, the book fair would be opened by an invited distinguished speaker. The book fair would run on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, closing at tea time on Saturday. Later on the Saturday evening, we would have a party in a discreet London location for our international visitors and for us, the conference organisers and the volunteers. The music was provided by the People's War sound system run by John's sons Michael and Keith. On the Sunday evening, we regularly closed the book fair week with what was intended to be a fundraising concert. I don't think we ever raised much money from it, and we had to rely on talented artists donating their performances to the cause. But we did have some fantastic evenings. Linton and Dennis Bovell band, the famous jazz musician Randy Weston, Talib Kibwe. We had some great concerts. It might surprise you to know how few music artists at the time were willing to donate their efforts to this cause. On the Thursday and Friday afternoons of the book fair, we would run sessions for secondary school pupils to meet and interact with many of the brilliant local and international black writers we had attracted to the event. John had said to me in organisational meetings, Roxy, you work in education, you can organise some sessions for school kids. Oh, John, how am I going to do this? I've got so much, I'm doing so much, oh God, I can't. John would never take no for an answer. In the end, we were able to do it because we had built up contacts over the years with liberal and radical secondary school teachers of English who were willing to bring some of their classes. But John didn't leave me alone. He said, on the Saturday of the book fair, we should put on a session for black supplementary school pupils from around London. He waved away my negative protestation on the grounds that I ran a supplementary school and would know what to do. So I'd find myself on book fair Saturdays in an empty room with about 100 black supplementary school pupils from around London expecting to be entertained. I tried Linton once. He said, no way.
I was busy.
School children, oh my God. Each year, somehow I managed to cobble together a program for them using writers, musicians, drummers, dancers and other performers. You can see brief clips from one of these sessions from the video about the book fair, which is available on YouTube, made by Agence Médiaire, and it's referenced on the back of your handout. So if you click on there, there's a little video of an event in 2005 where we launched this book, and Magnus Abdallah from Agence Médiaire from France had made this half-hour video, but included clips from the book fair, clips from the book fair supplementary sessions with the children. Another aspect of the book fair structure was its extension away from its base in London, to Manchester, to Bradford Leeds, to Scotland, to Trinidad. In Manchester, we had already developed an extension of the Black Pence movement, and so it was natural for us to extend book fair events there each year. The key person there was Gus John. In Bradford, a political formation called the Bradford Black Collective had developed a close relationship with the Race Today Collective. Subsequently, a group of activists there established a connection with our political alliance. This allowed us to build a regular book fair presence and series of book fair events there annually. Prominent in this effort was Ali Hussein. Our ideological alignment in politics and culture with the Booker Prize-winning writer from Scotland, Jim Kelman, led him, working with us, to stage the Scottish Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books in Glasgow in 1993 and 1995. We also launched another sister event, the Caribbean People's International Book Fair and Book Fair Festival in Trinidad in 1987 and 1988. Its organisational base was the radical Trinidad Oilfields Workers Trade Union, with which John was closely associated for most of his life. He was its European representative for decades. Prominent in putting on the Trinidad Book Fair were Errol MacLeod, David Abdullah and Lennox Peer. I want to mention some other considerations. The first one is the question of administration. The successful execution of the book fair was an enormous administrative feat and achievement. It couldn't have happened without the detailed and expert work behind the scenes of John's partner, the late Sarah White. Apart from putting together the book fair programme and organising its circulation, she had to arrange the publishers and booksellers' stands in the book fair hall and the physical handling of the books and publications for hundreds of these exhibitors and booksellers, some of them very contrary and difficult to deal with. She also had to often get involved in the detailed travel arrangements for our international visitors. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the socialising on the sidelines. Because another great achievement of the book fair was the meeting of the continents. People from all over the world mingled, mixed, made new connections and plans for actions. I think some of them had romances as well. One special and unforgettable socialising site at the book fair was around John and Sarah White's kitchen table at 2 Albert Road in Finsbury Park, later in the evenings after book fair forums. Unbelievably, on top of her onerous book fair organisational duties, Sarah would lay on food and drink to fuel the noisy and exciting debates. The noisiest were the Nigerian intellectuals, whose vehement discussions made some people anxious and worried the disturbing fights were about to break out. Anybody here with their stuff and connections will know what I'm talking about. There's also around the book for the question of terminology, because at the time and over the years, many people have wanted to call the book fair the Black Book Fair, and have been irritated by what they felt to be a cumbersome title. The title is as it is because of the patient but firm insistence of John Arose. John was very precise and exacting in his choice of words. International. That says uniting the black and brown diaspora. Book fair. Books as the source of serious ideas for liberation, linking the generation. John said, colonial policy was based on a deliberate withholding of information from the population. There was also discontinuity of information from generation to generation. Publishing, therefore, was a vehicle to give an independent validation to one's own culture, history, politics, a sense of self, and to make a break with the discontinuity. So, book fair. Of radical black. Not any old black. Badenoch Braverman. At that time, Savimbi in Angola linked with apartheid and the CIA, Mobutu and all these kind of people. Not any black, radical black. And third world, the impoverished peoples of what is now called the Global South. So the choice of International Book Fair of radical black and third world books had a meaning. And however cumbersome, I think it's worth holding on to it. So when I mentioned earlier on the book fair call, again, John had some precise words. He said the book fair was intended to mark the new and expanding phase in the growth of radical ideas and concepts and their expression in literature, politics, music, art, and social life. These have burst forth from the failure of the post-war settlements to satisfy people's urges and aspirations. New publishing centres have emerged to express the growth of these ideas, establish their autonomy, and to break the hold of the metropolitan publishing centres, both from the Third World and the metropolitan countries. The International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books will be a meeting of the continents for writers, publishers, distributors, booksellers, artists, musicians, filmmakers, and the people who inspire and consume their creative productions. So that was the call to the book fair as John envisaged it. Sometimes people have asked what he meant by the failure of the post-war settlements to satisfy people's urges and aspirations. I think by that John meant after World War II, across the colonies there were independence and liberation movements, and people had great hopes for the future. But throughout the Caribbean and Africa, people found that their hopes were dashed, that what came with independence didn't satisfy their urges and aspirations. There was a massive feeling of disappointment. People have often asked, why did the book fair come to an end, given how successful it was and how important it was? By the early 1990s, 2 of the 3 founding organisers of the book fair, Bogle Louverture and Race Today, had withdrawn from the organising committee of the book fair. Despite the addition of a few other publishers like Griot Media, LKJ Records and Books, and Longside Press, the overwhelming administrative and organisational burden landed on the New Beacon network, and really that meant on Sarah White. Organising the book fair was a 12-month operation. As soon as one book fair ended, detailed planning had to start on the next one. John had since 1983 had very serious heart problems, which worsened in 1996. Many people said that the book fair was vital and must continue, but melted away when asked to take practical responsibility and give their time to ensuring this happened. I took a leading role in the decision early in 1997 to bring the book fair to an end. Here is how I saw it at the time. I wrote as follows. Sorry about my coffee, I've had a bad cold for the last week. This is what I wrote. When we started the book fair, there was a strong sense that as black people, we needed to break through our marginalisation in culture, as we had broken through politically in the years leading up to and including 1981. By culture, we referred to a combination of literature, politics, music, art and social life. We were attempting to rally black writers, publishers, distributors, booksellers, artists, musicians and filmmakers. So the conclusion was, while in one sense the conscious expression of radical political and cultural ideas has become less overt, on the other hand, in a general sense, we have made an overall advance since 1982 in all the fields mentioned above, in the sense that it is no longer possible for anyone to seriously consider any of these fields without taking into account the black people's dimension. So when we started the book fair, we were out there. By the time we finished the book fair, people had to reckon with us across all those fields. This advance means that the book fair is no longer indispensable to political and cultural activists as a focus of organisation. The book fair has been successful in its aim of stimulating many other centres of cultural production. One thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about tonight was, in those days, you couldn't buy books from black people easily. I can remember going to my local W.H. Smith's with a book that New Beacon were publishing that I'd been involved in the editorial, called Jamaica Airman by E. Martin Noble, about a Jamaican guy who'd come over in World War II and his adventures in the RAF. You couldn't buy it in a normal shop. So I went to my local W.H. Smith's and asked for the manager and said, would you be willing to sell this book? I don't know, well, maybe we'll take one copy. So that's what it was like when we started the book fair. And by the end of the book fair, black writers were able to find publishers. Another thing that happened at the time, it was so hard for black writers to get published that New Beacon would be approached by all kinds of black writers and saying, can we give you my manuscript? And they said, look, we can't, we're a tiny publisher. In fact, John and Sarah didn't call themselves a publishing house, they called New Beacon a publishing maisonette. But people would say, no, please take my manuscript. And they said, look, we haven't got the capacity to read your manuscript, and we haven't got the capacity to publish them, we haven't got the money. People would still hand over the manuscripts, and people like me were involved in trying to read them. But then people would turn on New Beacon angrily for not publishing their work and saying, you're a publisher, a black publisher, I'm a black writer, and you won't even publish my work. So that's how it was before we started the book fair. And by the end of the book fair, major publishers were happy to publish black writers, and we know where we are now. So the book fair has been successful in its aim of stimulating many other centres of cultural production. This can be clearly seen by considering the changes to our position in the following fields since 1982. Black press, publishing, writers, booksellers and distributors, actors and TV, actors in theatre, filmmakers, musicians and artists. I saw a headline recently by Rudolph Walker, the actor, who obviously had a really hard time. But one thing I disagreed with him is he was saying, oh, nothing's changed for black actors. And I'm going, no, don't believe that. And one of the things those of us who did the book fair have always been clear about, although things can be bad for us, we can suffer a lot of discrimination, it's wrong to say things are just the same as they were before. They're not. We did achieve something. We haven't achieved everything. And I think in the field of acting, it's clearly not the case that the opportunities for black actors haven't changed from 40 years ago. The international dimension was also something I wrote about at the time. I said, since the book fair began in 1982, there have been a number of significant reverses internationally, e.g. the collapse of the Grenada Revolution, the disasters in Africa, apart from South Africa, but in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, Ghana, and so on. It's significant, for instance, how much the participation in the book fair of the Nigerians has diminished. Because when we start the book fair, there's loads of radical Nigerian intellectuals coming over full of hope about change they could make in Nigeria. And gradually, it all went away. It was the time of the IMF and World Bank's structural adjustment programs, which basically wrecked most of the third world. I said, it's significant, for instance, how much the participation in the book fair of Nigerians has diminished, but the British dimension at the same time, because of earlier successful political activism reaching high points in 1981 and 1985 that Linton mentioned, there's been a penetration by black people into significant areas of British life, e.g. Parliament, he mentioned the 4 black MPs, local councils and local authority employment. After the uprisings in the early 1980s, the government, was the Thatcher government, were badly frightened, and I think Michael Heseltine was the local government minister, and he actually said, I think in an article in the Times, we must embark urgently on the creation of a black middle class in this country, because the black population is so rebellious that every time something dissatisfies them, it goes straight to the streets. And so they actually then deployed lots of money around local authorities in the country to have access programs, for example, access to education, teaching, access to social work. So a lot of
inner city revival.
Yeah, and a lot of black people are the beneficiaries. So actually, for the first time, a lot of black people were able to get good jobs that are pensionable and regular in local authorities, and that came out of the balance. So that was another advance that had happened in the time when we were doing the book fair. Another practical point that also came up in the discussion to end the book fair was the changing situation and increased pressures at work for many people, which affected 3 key aspects of the book fair. First was the presence of the more mainstream publishers in the book fair. Secondly, the attendance of school children at the book fair school sessions that were arranged for them. And thirdly, the ability of volunteers to take time off work to help with the organisation and running of the book fair. Where mainstream publishers such as Heinemann or Longman, who had important black titles on their lists, had had the time and the personnel to staff their stalls over the 3 days of the book fair in the 1980s and had enjoyed meeting their reading public and other publishers, by the 1990s, such a leisurely culture was not appropriate, so the economic model had changed. Their staffing levels had been cut to the point that sparing someone for that number of days was virtually impossible. The result was that the mainstream publishers could only attend the book fair through a distributor, or if the book fair organisers staffed their stalls for them. The latter was not a particularly good solution, as the volunteers staffing such a stall were not necessarily familiar with the books that were on it. The schools were under similar pressures, with teachers having little time to take initiatives or organise an outing to something like the book fair during the normal school day. So we got the advent of regression education, the national curriculum, teachers being pinned down, not allowed to do what they wanted to teach. The Thatcher government hated the Labour local authorities and were very upset that they thought every teacher was left-wing, and they actually then, during that time, abolished the Inner London Education Authority, for example, which is sort of a hotbed, and they also abolished the Greater London Council, where with Ken Livingstone funding a lot of initiatives. So it was much harder for teachers to say, I'm going to take my kids to this amazing book fair, meet all these writers. So having to do all pinned down to do all these curriculums, and the school managements wouldn't let them go out. So that was another problem. And also the volunteers who helped with the book fair were also finding it increasingly difficult to take time off work with the new anti-union regimes at the workplace, etc. The new management culture and education in other workplaces left little space for manoeuvre. So with all of these things, after an in-depth discussion and analysis, the organising committee decided to end the book fair and its accompanying book fair festival in its current format, and issued a statement to that effect in February 1997. And another thing to say about the ending of the book fair, this didn't bother John La Rose at all. He had a very sanguine attitude to the lifespan of movements that he was involved in. And Sarah White said that in a letter to Kamau Brathwaite about the ending of the Caribbean artist movement, John had said that organisations flourish, flower, they belong to a certain time, then they die. And to quote John directly from a letter he wrote to Kamau Brathwaite on the 4th of September 1997, CAM is a movement, Caribbean artist movement, a very real one, not a structure. We too have struck a chord. With such things in my experience, people take out of it what they are looking for and bring what they must give. Then the communion is over. The structure remains long after the communion is done, and it lives, and we inherit it, and it passes on. The vital spark of life and spontaneity I have discovered in my own life is not long-lasting. Glowing embers remain, and we mistake it for fire. I think I'll stop there, and any comments or questions we can have.
I would just like to add a few comments to what Roxy said. I was one of the organizers of the book fair, firstly as a part of the Race Today team. And one of my main duties was to organize the evenings of international poetry. And I also read at many of these poetry events. I think one of the most spectacular ones we had was in 1982. Where is it? The front of the book. With poets from all over the world, and I got to meet poets that I had myself admired as a aspiring young poet. And can you find me the page where that Evening of International Poetry was? I'm talking about people like Kamau Brathwaite, Edouard Glissant from Martinique, and I was also instrumental in the invitation of poets from Jamaica, some of whom were known as dub poets like Michael Smith, Okwonura, and other poets like Jean Binta Breeze and Lorna Goodison. Some of that. One of the best international evenings of poetry that we had included John Agard, James Berry, Valerie Bloom, Paul Dakeo, Mahmoud Jamal, Jack Mapanji, Archie Markham, Pedro Perez Sardoui, Mustaq Singh, and others.
You know, John, that was John had a thing about that. Another of these things, and I'm not being falsely modest about this, but at the time I was young.
We were all young.
And when John came up with these things, I was always, what I said in the talk was true. I was all thinking, so he's going, International Poetry Evening. Oh, God, poetry. John loved poetry. And I thought, this is never going to work, We had it in the Camden Centre, and I've never seen anything like it. 1,000 people turned up on a rainy Tuesday evening. Just, what? And it was just absolutely fantastic. And luckily, recordings are available of that evening. It was just one of those evenings, that collection of people. It's fantastic.
So not only was I reading, but I would sit down with John and we would work out who were going to be invited and what the running order should be, who should read when. And throughout the book fair, I was the compere for most of the international poetry events. But the book fair festival week itself consisted not just of poetry readings, there were prose readings. There was dance groups performed. There was music, as Roxy mentioned. You've got it. It's all on this piece of paper here that Roxy prepared. Films. We showed quite a few films. Some of which included Rue Cazeneuve. You know this film? Set in Martinique during the time of slavery. Battle of Algiers, The Dutchman by the American writer Miri Baraka. The Mangrove 9, which was subsequently made into a movie by Steve McQueen. But the original Mangrove 9 film was a documentary. Blood Aga Run by Menelik Shabazz about the riots. And Riots and Rumors of Riots by Imru Bakari. For me, the book fair festival captured the spirit of the time, of the 1980s, and was a vehicle for the new and emerging young musicians, poets, novelists, dancers, actors, and whatever. Roxy has given you some of the factors which led to the demise of the book fair, but I always like to think that the book fair, as a marketplace for books, was a victim of its own success, because one of the ideas behind the book fair was to stimulate an interest in literature within the black community. The demand there was always there for books, but not necessarily, literary writing, but books on black history and culture and politics and so on. So the book fair helped to stimulate interest in literature. And some of the mainstream publishers, Oxford University Press, Heinemann, Virago, and all of them, started to participate in the book fair and realized that there was up-and-coming black readership, and there was a market out there for this kind of literature, and they wanted piece of the action. So they began to publish more black writers. I mean, the whole thing about, nowadays black writers are part of the mainstream. But back in the day, you couldn't go into W.H. Smith's, as Roxy said, and found a book and pick up a book by a black author. It's just, So in a sense, the book fair became a victim of its own success. Another thing I would like to say is that this book fair, with writers from all over the world, musicians, painters, sculptors from all over the world, was organized without a single penny of public funding. Not a penny. There was no Arts Council grants, there was no lottery fund grant. It was all, because one of the principles that we organized on was the principle of autonomy. And we did it ourselves. People coming from abroad would sleep on
the Friends of the Book Fair, that, you know, people would sleep on your settee, or if you had a spare room, you would put people up and so on. No hotels, no hotel bills to pay. We couldn't afford it anyway, you know. And it worked. It worked for 12 book fairs between 82 and 95. Yeah, I think I'll stop
I'll
there.
just add a couple of things to that Linton said. One of the things is that the International Book for Radical Black and Third World Books isn't very well known. And I think that's deliberate. Because in the narrative about the black presence in Britain, very carefully it's excluded that black people have lived the life of the mind. So we all know the narrative that's absolutely established with film clips. They go, Windrush playing the Calypso, London is a place for me. Then they go, Notting Hill, 1958, riots. Then they go, Carnival, 76, the clip of the police car reversing up the street and being pelted by black youths. Then they go 1981 Brixton riots. And then they go 1985 Broadwater Farm. And so it goes on. So it establishes very firmly that black people are instinctual people, fly off the handle, have no brain thing. And this achievement, 13 years worth of this massive achievement with all these people all over the world. You've seen some of the range of forums, what the discussion points were. It's as if it never happened. So I think it's really important that we establish this for future generations to know you can also take this path with your life. You don't have to play sports and play music, nothing wrong with that, but restricted that little box. And I noticed a headline in the paper yesterday saying there's a new international network of people doing race science again, as they did in the 1960s. Black people are genetically, intellectually inferior to white people. So that's one thing about the book fair. The thing that Linton was saying about we managed to do it brings a couple of memories of things like driving visitors around London to where they had to go, or going to the airport to pick them up, having people staying in your house. And I think it was a brilliant thing because all kind of connections were made between black community people and these famous people from all around the world. And I'm thinking earlier today about, I can remember a couple of visitors that had in my house. One was a guy called Mohammed Arbi, who was an Algerian revolutionary who'd been a key figure in the FLN in Algeria, getting independence from France. He stayed, and my children said, "We don't like that man," because he was a very solemn bloke who'd spent years underground and very cautious. So when they were doing all this stuff, he was very guarded. Another person I remember was Louise Merriweather, who died last year at the age of 100, famous American writer. But there was
I met her in New York.
Yeah.
When I was at NYU as artist in residence.
Yeah.
Nice lady.
Yeah.
But yeah, what you said about the book fair not being well known, I mean, it was a crime, really. But when you think back on it, you know, you had eminent writers like C.L.R. James, Wally Shoinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, major, big writers, and nothing about that, nothing, not even a mention. But we have to bear in mind that in 1982, for all intentions and purposes, black people in this country were still on the periphery of British society. It wasn't until the end of the 80s, it wasn't until the early part of the 90s, going up to the end of the 20th century, that we slowly started to become a part of the mainstream. prior to that, we were on the margins of British society. I think I'll shut up there and get some questions from you. Yes.
So you talked about the Caribbean artist movement, and I can see that Larose, Sulky, Brathwaite are all represented in the kind of forum topics and the activities that were happening with the book fair. But for you personally, like you were just saying about black people being on the margins and the periphery as they were until the later part of the 20th century. But for you personally, do you think, were you inspired by what the Caribbean artist movement had achieved? And do you think that with that movement that they'd started that journey of bringing black people into the mainstream?
I am a child of the Caribbean artist movement. I became involved in with the Caribbean artist movement towards the end of its life. I always like to say that I am what the cooling embers of the movement spawned. I was tremendously inspired by the Caribbean artist movement, and it helped to shape my own aesthetic, my own approach to creativity, to music and poetry. Yes.
I remember the first edition that I saw anyway of Linton's Dreadbeaten Blood had a fantastic illustration on the cover by Errol Lloyd, wasn't it?
Errol Lloyd,
Yeah.
one of our
And Errol Lloyd was part of the
prominent
Caribbean artist
painters.
movement, but it's a fantastic illustration on the cover. Is that cover still available for people to see?
Yeah, I've got.
Yeah.
There was during Errol Lloyd had a retrospective here last year of his work, and that was on display. But it was the image of a black youth standing on a corner or something like that, with his red, gold, and green woolly hat, and it was the first time an image like that appeared on a book cover. As simple as it sounds, it was something new.
And the ripples that you were talking about, the influence from that book cover. I was teaching black kids in school in Walthamstow who weren't bothered about schooling and education. So I can remember getting Linton's book and just putting it on my desk. And so I'd said to them, "Oh, read this," they'd go, they don't want to do it. So I just put the book on the desk and they'd look, "Oh, this book, some black youths wearing a tam, red, green and gold. What's this?" So that's a ripple from the Caribbean artist movement. Errol the artist, Linton the poet, the book, and through to the general population. So yeah, it's really influential.
Any more questions?
Or comments?
Yes.
I have a question. I was around during a lot of the book fairs and enjoyed them immensely. But I was always very curious to know, as a Scottish person, how did John get so many Scots people onto book fair events like Hamish Henderson, who gave remarkable poetry readings in Gaelic. Nobody understanding a word of Gaelic, but appreciating the artistry of the man. And Jackie Kay and James Calman, who was one of the Booker Prize winners, and Alistair Gray, Poor Things. Where did he get all these people from?
Okay, well, I mean, the answer to that is quite important, is John was not a populist. So a lot of people in the movement were black populists. So there was other poets like Adonis. I can remember hearing this guy doing Arabic poetry, and it was stunning. I didn't understand it, but the whole feel of it. But so it was something that John fought for. So for example, when we had international prose reading, he invited Jim Kelman. So there was a lot of ideological tensions in the book fair. Like there was a black nationalist strand, so they would go, "What's this white guy doing reading prose, a Scottish Glaswegian guy reading Glaswegian prose. This is supposed to be a black event. But John insisted on quality and what people were saying and where they stood. That's really important.
The Scottish presence, I think, had a lot to do with the friendship between John La Rose and Jim Kelman. I think they both worked on a building site together. I think that's where they first met, before James Kelman became famous and won the Booker Prize. I think that's where that started.
They also had a keen interest in language and using your language. So Kelman's book was written in his Scots dialect, and I think that was very important to John as well.
Yeah.
People speak how they want to speak.
Yeah.
Oh, we also had people from the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, because we were supporting, our political groups were supporting the miners during that strike in 85. Was it 85 or 86?
84 and 85.
Yeah. And I think we had a couple of women who, there was a group of women poets who went around supporting the miners. And they also became involved in the book fair. Jean Gittins was one of them. Thank you, Jean Ambrose.
Yeah.
Jean Ambrose here was one of the organizers of the book fair. She was a member of the Race Today collective. Yes,
Okay, sorry,
please.
yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. What you said about the book fair being like a very symmetry really struck me because I think my generation, I was born after the book fair ended. We don't know a lot about like black radical movements in the latter half of the 20th century, well even like throughout the 20th century in Britain. So I want to know like your opinions about how we can build connections between like your generation and mine, so we pass that vital information on, so we can continue doing the work.
Firstly, through events like this. Secondly, through an institution like the George Padmore Institute, which as an archive of those movements and those struggles that were being waged back in the day before you were born.
Yeah, I should say one thing is very encouraging is we've got a lot of people using the archive for their research, and it's like all kinds of people, including BA students, MA students, PhD students from all different countries around the world. Probably Linton has this experience as well as me. People come and interview you, and then they put stuff into their academic writing. So hopefully this is a way in which it becomes more available for younger people, that more people are beginning to write about.
It's precisely because the question you ask is precisely because of what you asked, why we put on this event, Black History Month. We thought this is the appropriate time for us to revisit the book fair,
And
for the benefit of your generation.
And things like this, a meeting of the continents, gives a really detailed jumping off point. And also the handout that was on your chair, I thought if you want to, luckily these days you've got the internet, when I list a lot of names you can always look them up and find out a bit more about some of these people.
Roxy, you just mentioned the internet. Back in those days, of course, there was no internet.
No mobile phones.
Or mobile phones. But we discussed, one of the forums that we had at the book fair was on new technology, because it had just started to the revolution in new technology began around that time. So one of the things we talked about was the revolution in new technology and how it would impact communication, work, and artistic creativity. And we were way ahead of our time with those discussions and debates.
We came up a lot in the book fair forums, And one of the things that John was incredibly far-sighted about, and he was always talking about, and he had a slogan that I can still remember, and he said the new technologies, he said it was ridiculous that the 40-hour week had come in the 1880s, and we're in the 1980s, and people are still working 40 hours a week. But he said the new technologies should open up the opportunities for a shorter working day, shorter working week, a shorter working life, and more time for rest, recreation, and cultural creativity. And one of the insights John had was that a lot of the most advanced creations in culture came from people who are unemployed because they had the time. And if you do, it's quite interesting, if you do a little you hear the thing about recently in this country about Oasis. Oh, Oasis, they're selling out all the things. There were some guys from Manchester on the dole.
Like UB40.
UB40. And then the black, John had a particular insight about black creativity. So he's saying, well, in Trinidad, a lot of the guys who did the pan and the carnival movement were semi-employed or unemployed people. The blues, the jazz, the reggae were all guys who were, because they had the time for cultural creativity. So we haven't got there, have we? We're working more and longer and have less time. But his vision is we should be fighting for more time for all these things.
Yeah, and I wrote a poem
Yeah, great point.
about it called More Time and recorded it on one of my reggae albums. Check it out.
It's good. It's really good.
Can you talk about, you mentioned that people, there was like, not so much infighting, but different ideological beliefs within organising and like creating the book fair each year. Can you talk about how those were navigated and how you maintained, or as a group maintained, like the forward vision? Because I think that's something that still comes up, and it can feel difficult to have what can feel like opposing views and still recognise there is a common goal.
I think it's a really important point.
Can I say a few? I think the book fair was a broad church. So there was everybody there. We had black nationalists, we had Pan-Africanists, we had socialists, we had Marxist-Leninists, we even had Maoists. People involved in the trade union movement, and some liberals as well. And we all tolerated each other. You know, it was a broad church, you know, and so that there was room for everybody to express their own points of view and so on.
But I think as a young person, I learned, I take what you're saying, I learned it really from John, because I was much more impatient than, you know, so for example, John would always send out publicity about what we're doing to all kinds of people. And I would say, oh, John, why are you bothering these people? And they never come, they never participate in anything we do. Why are you bothering to send them stuff? And he says it's important that they know that we're doing this. So, I mean, for example, someone like Diane Abbott, she might have come to one book fair event.
She participated
Yeah,
in one of the
yeah,
book
but she
fairs.
wasn't like, you know, but John would send all these Labour MPs, all these people, stuff, and they never really...
Jeremy Corbyn came to
Jeremy
to
Corbyn.
the book fair.
But so he was very good at saying, there's a range of tendencies, we don't agree, we can dialogue, and stuff, you know, where some more young people, less sophisticated, would be angry with people we didn't agree with. So I think that was something I learned from him, how you can keep things going. I can remember an example of how difficult it was when we were trying to set up the bookstall for the book fair. Some of the black nationalist people didn't really want to take part in the book fair because they didn't agree with us, but they felt they had to because a lot of people were
We're going to
coming
be there.
and they were going to benefit. So lots of years they'd be saying to Sarah White, we're not taking part in this thing unless this and this and blah, blah, blah. So there was stuff like that would go on, so you just have to just ride it out. And they would turn up and they would have their stalls there. And I noticed in the book, there's comments from people when we ended the book fair. And I remember one person who didn't really agree with this was Paul Coates of Black Classic Press. But he wrote a really nice thing when the book fair ended and said how important it was. And he's a guy whose son is a celebrity, Ta-Nehisi Coates. So he used to come over every year. Didn't particularly agree with us, but he thought it was important. So it is a problem. And is it accurate that people tolerate each other? Really not at all now amongst younger people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to organise.
But is it because of online stuff, or what's the reason for it?
I think it feels like we're more silos, and in a way because online exists, and because everyone is so, like you said, busy or overworked, there isn't as much communing in person or hashing things out in person. So if you feel like there's a group of people that on a base level you don't agree with, you're not even going to make the time to really meet with them. You'll meet with the people you do agree with and connect with them. So yeah, I don't know. Coalition building, I feel like is still kind of that we need more of it, and it feels quite nascent sometimes still.
It reminded me that sometimes we'd be doing a forum or a meeting and somebody starts shouting. Oh God, you know, he was shouting, and then John used to say, people say, shut up, you know, get that. And then John would say, no, come. He put them on the stage and say, okay, what do you want to say? And most times they last about 20 seconds and then run out. But he didn't say, kick them out and get rid of them. So I don't think people have changed that much. And I would have, if I was young now, I'm not sure, and without John's influence, I think I'd be intolerant.
Any more questions or contributions? There's a young lady
Yeah, there's
there.
somebody there.
I'm just struck because I'm from India and I saw that you have Anand Patwardhan on here as well.
Yes, very, very, very good, amazing filmmaker.
Yeah, and there are two of his films mentioned, but I haven't heard of those. So there's actually these older films, and he's well known now in India for like his later films. And I was thinking with a comment you made about how this was all before the age of the internet, and it's remarkable the reach, like the people y'all were in touch with from like Nigeria, like you have Yusuf Abala Asman all the way from Nigeria, and then you have Anand Patwardhan from India. And I was just curious if you knew how people made these connections in an era of like, well, not so much internet. So it's not like you go and Google who are the best filmmakers in India right now and just invite them.
Well, John LaRose was apart from being a man of great erudition, he was well connected to a global network of left-wing people involved in not just in politics but in the arts as well. And I think that's how that connection was made.
And also John was multilingual, so Spanish and French, and he knew the literatures in those languages as well. So, I mean, we did have people from Martinique and Guadeloupe
and Latin America, and Africa, and Asia, and United States, Germany, France, and so on, yeah. And one of the significant things about all of that is that it showed the British establishment that black people in Britain were not alone. We had allies all over the world who we could call upon for support if and when we needed it.
Yeah, a couple of things that happened at the book fair along those lines was I always remember what we called the Black Germans. There was a group called Initiative Schwarze Deutsche. So we didn't know that there was black people in Germany. So suddenly all these young people came over from Germany and said, oh, it's great what you're doing. We're suffering so much in Germany and you're doing all these things. So we met all these young people who were black, had one black parent and one white parent from Germany. And we also met Les Beurs, which was the Arab youth movement people. They came over
From France.
And one of them, Mognis Abdallah, is still in touch with us, and he was the one who made all these films about the book fair and other activities we were doing. So we actually found all these people who came to us that we didn't know existed, and we were able to have sort of connections with.
Yes, at the back there.
Just hopefully relatively quick. I'm just struck by just on the question of generational change. Always looking back to this period and a bit before, how central, I guess what we call now creative writers, were to political activism. Looking now at 2024, that doesn't seem to be the case, and that's black writers and all others. And I'm just curious your two reflections on that. What has changed? Why has that changed? Is it just about mainstreaming, or is something else happening?
Mainstreaming has a lot to do with it. The fact that, back in those days, many people were on the periphery. Now they're in the mainstream. The political climate has changed as well. There were several defeats. I mean, back in the 80s and so on, we had victories, but we also had defeats. And the left has been severely weakened in this country. In mainstream politics, it's the free market ideology, which is the dominant ideology of the time. And also, because the political climate has changed, I think people involved in the creative arts are not as focused in their creativity on political issues as they were back in the day.
John also had something interesting to say about how political people on the left should behave in relation to creative artists. And I think, well, certainly when I was young, a lot of people on the left required creative artists to produce stuff that reflected the line, the political line. And John never said that. He said creative artists have got to be free to express through art how they feel in relation to the political currents that they're part of. And that was quite unusual at the time. And it may be that a lot of people on the left haven't found a way to allow creative artists to be free, and maybe denounce them if there's aspects of their work that isn't.
And young writers back in the days who hadn't become who weren't famous back in the days of the book fairs took that on board. People like Ben Okri, for example, or Carol Phillips, the novelist, for example. They were just youngsters just starting out in the book fair days, and the book fair provided great inspiration for them.
I've got something that happened which is quite interesting. At the time of the book fair, there was a situation where Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Verses, was published. And it seems like a long time ago, but it was a really hot thing at the time because a lot of Islamists took exception to the book.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa that said that Salman Rushdie should be killed. So it so happened we were having one of our Bradford book fairs, and the Islamists there were saying if we sold a book there, they're going to come in and wreck the place and do all sorts of stuff. And I think it's quite interesting how John reacted to that. In the opening address, the International Book Fair, Radical Black and Third World Books in Bradford, 1989, which Bradford-based Islamic radicals had threatened, John wrote this: Salman Rushdie has apologized for the offense he has given to sincere Muslim believers. But some, who speak in the name of Allah the Beneficent, the Merciful, have refused to grant him mercy. They demand that the death sentence pronounced by the Ayatollah Khomeini against the life of Salman Rushdie and his publishers be carried out. Many have already died. A serious writer cannot compromise his imagination, cannot write to order, cannot censor himself, though he may state and restate, write and rewrite in search of form, in search of beauty, in search of truth. Believers have the right to believe. Writers have their right to write. Between belief and expression, there is a right to statement and counter-statement, to argument and counter-argument. This is where I stand. So he put that in the book fair program in Bradford at the height of this Islamist saying, we're going to come in, we're going to kill people, we're going to wreck the place, we're going to do all these things. He wrote that. So it's a really uncompromising, clear stance. And then he also, and this is something he did, he sent a telemessage to Thatcher. And one of the things that Linton remember is he always sent messages to, if some, okay, I'll give an example. It'd be night time, late at night, I get a phone call. John would say, there's this youth called so-and-so, so-and-so. He's being held in Tooting police station. Ring up and ask why they're holding him. So all of us would ring up. Why are you holding so-and-so in the police? What? And sometimes we phone the Home Office. Why are they holding this youth in Tooting? So he was always one for letting the people in power know. So he sent a message to Thatcher. We are outraged at the threat against the life of Salman Rushdie pronounced by Ayatollah Khomeini on account of his book Satanic Verses. We support freedom of the imagination and freedom of expression, which ultimately result in the publication of books. We utterly condemn the fascist Nazi practice of public book burning. It's happening in America now. We request that the British government give full protection to Salman Rushdie. So he sent Thatcher a message saying that. So there's a lot of stuff around books, what the artists can do, how radical people should respond to artists. If you don't exactly agree with every word that's in their creativity, what do? Do you denounce them? Do you encourage them? I think it's a live question. Anybody else want to comment or question?
Okay, well, we call it a night then. Thank you all very much for coming. And do tell your friends about the exhibition downstairs, please.
Sorry, can I just add that if you're interested in the Book Fair archives, the full catalogue is available on the George Padmore Institute website, and it lists all the material we have. And we did have grants where we were able to transcribe some of those forums that Roxy and Linton talked about. So there's a lot of material that you can see what we've got, and if you make an appointment to go to the Institute, you can access that material and hear some of that lively debate yourself as well.
And don't forget the book, which is being sold at a reduced price. That was very good, Roxy. Well done.